Just as we were coming out on stage, George turned to me and said, hard to follow that one up. Maybe before we start, could we just give a round of applause again for Divine? This was really remarkable. You know, when we envisioned how to best spend the time here, one of the things that we were thinking about for this panel is really to follow on that and ask how, with what happened with Divine, can we try to do for more people? And how can this concept of precision psychiatry really be implemented on a wider scale to get the principles down, to get a theory down, to get a way and a workflow down? And that's what the goal is today, to try to start to look at some of the pieces of this and the best possible way to be able to realize and implement it. So I'm honored today to be joined by a really world-class group of internationally leading experts who span the full spectrum of stakeholders for moving the field forward toward this precision medicine approach that you heard Dr. Marks elaborate earlier. So just a round of quick introductions. Immediately to my left is George Yancopoulos. He's the co-founder and chief scientific officer of Regeneron Pharmaceuticals. David Lowenthal is the medical director for the Center for Practice Innovation at Columbia University. Rui Costa is the president and CEO of the Allen Institute, and Rhonda Robinson Beal is the senior vice president and deputy chief medical officer for mental health services at United Health Group. The sequencing of the human genome, which was first published in draft form in 2000, and more recently, since fully and comprehensively completed last year, is among really the greatest of achievements in the history of medicine and biology. And the enormity of this impact has been felt far and wide, from evolutionary biology to modern medical practice, and in particular with the dawn of this concept of precision medicine. Precision medicine is really this very innovative approach to healthcare that you just heard about that really tailors disease diagnosis, prevention, and treatment to the biology of each individual person. And in this regard, the modern revolution in human genetics and the decline in sequencing costs has really greatly facilitated this birth of precision medicine in a wide diversity of medical specialties, perhaps most notably, as Dr. Marks was just outlining, in oncology. But more recently, with our increasing knowledge of the genetic architecture of psychiatric illness and the molecular biology, circuit-level anatomy, and cellular-level physiology understanding of the brain, we finally reached a moment where we feel that the implementation of precision psychiatry has finally become possible. In today's panel, we're going to be exploring this enormous potential from the perspective of neuroscience, therapeutic development, healthcare innovation, and bioethics. Genome-wide association studies and more recently next-generation sequencing studies have been widely heralded across nearly every imaginable human trait and disease, offering increasing insight into the genetic architecture of human phenotypes and disease risk. However, recent work increasingly suggests that in addition to learning about individual genes, among the most insightful results from these human genetic studies may well be the entry point that they provide in mapping genetic risk onto distinct cell types and brain circuits. And the Allen Institute has been a pioneer in systematically and comprehensively reimagining neuroanatomy by mapping the cell types and regional connectivity of the mammalian and the human brain. Rui, how do you see this biology emerging, and in particular for gaining insight into the pathophysiology of neuropsychiatric disorders?
Good morning. Thank you, everyone. This is an amazing point, and it's great to be able to make this point after we heard from Sandra Marks and from Divine. So we've gone from symptoms to brain areas, to neurotransmitters. And just like the Human Genome Project allowed us to know what's normal and abnormal in terms of the genetic components, we need to now go and say which cell types in the brain, which neuron types are affected by these mutations or people's experiences that give rise to the symptoms. That patient that you saw that had the melanoma has a mutation that's all over the bone, but it affects a lot a specific cell type, the melanocytes. We don't know what the impact is, even of genetic predisposition, on specific cell types in the brain. But first we needed to create a parts list to map it out. So like the Human Genome Project, the Allen Institute is about to conclude a map of all the parts of the human brain, of the cell types, in normal. And then our hope is to map disease into that. What is the association of specific genotypes and specific symptoms to specific cell types? And also treatments. What are the effects of treatments on specific cell types? These will hopefully lead to biomarkers, to better diagnostics, better treatment, but also decrease stigma. If I could say when I have some issues that it's a particular cell type and a particular protein in that cell type, it changes how I see myself. Now, we can't do this alone. The Allen Institute does big projects for 10, 15 years that are foundational, and big efforts like the Center for Precision Psychiatry are important. We have to do it in consortium. This is bigger than what any of us can do. But the urgency is here today, as we heard during this conference. We have to do something about it. This is too important.
Thank you, Rui. George, I mean, let's say expanding on that, Regeneron has really assembled, I mean, arguably the most powerful human genetic sequencing program in the world, aiming for therapeutic drug development. And by integrating large-scale sequencing and longitudinal electronic health records, Regeneron has developed some transformative first-in-class medications, while at the same time greatly accelerating the timeline for innovation. Meanwhile, a substantial proportion of the pharmaceutical industry has largely abandoned novel therapeutic development for psychiatric illness because the conventional developmental process has been frustrated by insufficiently predictive model systems and pathophysiological insight. Can you give us an example of some of Regeneron's drug development strategy, how it's been so disruptive in this regard, and how you envision this approach to be successfully deployed for neuropsychiatric disease?
Πρώτα απ' όλα, καλημέρα όλους. Yes, Steve. First, maybe it's my job to, with all this promise that we're talking about, just to present this sobering reality that maybe a lot of people don't realize. Coming up with new treatments for disease is perhaps the hardest thing that humanity tries to do. I don't think people understand the numbers. In the United States alone, there's over 5,000 biotech and biopharma companies, not to mention millions of researchers in places like Columbia and Harvard and elsewhere. And do you know how many new medicines are approved every year by the FDA despite millions of researchers, thousands of companies, billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars? Less than 20 to 40 new drugs a year. And most of those are actually not really new drugs, they're Me Too's. It's very hard to come up with an important new medicine for an important disease. This is an industry of failure. This is why many have abandoned psychiatry, because of all the failures in that space. And so we have to understand that less than 1% of the programs that go into development succeed. I mean, that's really sobering reality. That's how hard it is. As you mentioned, we at Regeneron have bucked the odds. We have more than 10 times the average success. Why? Because we invested a lot in fundamental technologies and information generation. So we invested a lot in human sequencing. We are now the world's largest human sequencer. We've actually sequenced half of all the humans that have been sequenced on the planet. Actually, our efforts are headed by a young Greek-American scientist, Aris Baris. And what that has allowed us to do is understand human genetic variation in a way that hasn't really been available before. And we now can understand the genes. So we sequence so many people, each person linked to a detailed electronic record base, we understand how gene variation can cause disease. We can say, hey, this gene, this mutation can cause this disease. And we put that capability together with another special capability, which we've pioneered the ability to genetically humanize animal models, to create human models of disease in animals. We can literally replace 1, 2, 3% of an animal's genome to recreate disease processes that are very valid. So we can now test them. And we can use targeted therapies on genetically humanized models to really prove that, A, this gene causes this disease, and this therapy can actually help, not in an old-fashioned type of an animal model, but a genetically humanized animal model. And that's allowed us to have this productivity and success rate that we had. But consistent with what Rui said, it's not easy, but you can create genetically validated models, humanized models of the common causes of blindness, of asthma, of emphysema, of cancer. And we've done all that, and we've come up with treatments, the world's leading treatments for these diseases. But we are somewhat humbled by neuropsychiatric disorders. We don't really understand them. And this is why, as Rui said, this needs a really collective effort. And this is why things that are happening at the Nirkos Foundation Center for Precision Psychiatry and Mental Health, they're so important. We need people who really understand this to do what you guys are trying to do in terms of trying to create relevant animal models of neuropsychiatric disorders. And we all need to get together to partner to understand the genetic basis. In our databases, we don't have enough well-characterized neuropsychiatric illnesses so that we can relate the genetics that we're seeing and the genetic variation to those. We need to work with specialized groups to do that. So as I said, we're somewhat humbled at how hard it is, but we have hope if, like Rui says, we can all get together and we can figure this out and we can find the right partners. We can bring what people like us have to the table, which is the power of some of these technologies, with some of the expertise and the specific focus that efforts such as the SNF Center at Columbia are bringing. And I think that does give us hope in this very overwhelming and difficult arena.
Thank you, George. And actually, I want to transition to Rhonda because I think we can pick up from there in terms of phenotyping and clinical characterization. So precision psychiatry, of course, is fundamentally about leveraging each individual's biology and their lifetime experiences in the service of improving the accuracy and the utility of diagnosis, prevention, and treatment. And we've been talking extensively so far about the power of genomics and biology, but psychiatry has not yet integrated genetics into the current standard of care. But United Health Group has recently taken a pioneering approach to leveraging arguably the most data-rich resource that's currently available in mental and behavioral health, and that is through different kinds of clinical records, individual level records, longitudinal records, electronic medical records. And United Health Group's been using machine learning and other artificial intelligence methods to build increasingly accurate predictors of health outcomes to facilitate providers with evidence-based personalized treatment planning. So what are some of the key areas of focus for United Health Group in this domain, and how do you see this potentially impacting care in the near term?
Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate that question. It's a loaded one. So first of all, let me explain what United Health Group is, because those who are from United States will think immediately, oh, you just pay claims, you pay providers, when actually United Health Group has two companies. One is United Health Care, and they pay providers and contract with providers. The other one is Optum, which is an organization that not only owns one of the largest health systems in terms of primary care, specialty care, but also in terms of a massive ability to accumulate data. So we service over 152 million individuals in the United States and globally. We also have access to claims, clinical data, and now acquiring data on social determinants of health as well as measurement-based care on 285 million individuals, because we cover information that comes from other health systems and other health insurers. So we're very rich in data. However, having the data without a very clear, concise use of markers becomes a very muddy picture, and let me explain. What we are good at looking at are trends. We can get a population that we can define by the diagnostic codes that we use right now and take it through primary, secondary, tertiary diagnosis, incorporate medical diagnosis into that, and create a cohort. Within that cohort, if it was pure, if it was a true marker, you would expect that there be very little variation in the use of treatments that are out there. Now, very wide, extremely wide variation in terms of the numbers of treatments, the types of treatments, the lengths of treatment. So it's really pointing to the fact that our current system is not really addressing the true markers in that regard. Because of that, what happens is we are inefficient, we are ineffective. For those who have any contact with those who've gone through therapy, it may go on for a long period of time, it may be very short. They may have to go from one therapist to the next because of therapeutic alliance or other types of things that affect them. And what has been successful in the past may not be successful in the future, depending upon the kind of traumas and environmental experiences that people have had. So there's so many variables that makes it difficult in order to really treat concisely and effectively. Because of that, what we're doing and what we can do with the tools that we have is to look at data, look at trends, and again, as we're starting to collect measurement-based care information, in other words, measurement done by providers not only as part of an assessment, but also during the treatment, we're beginning to be able to see and be able to segment out the population by risk, kind of a predictive risk. We're able to understand this population is very likely to go on to have a more severe journey in mental health in terms of the types of hospitalizations, the medications that are being taken from that perspective. The other thing that we're able to do is to look into a real-life clinical situation. We're using neurocognitive tools to begin to identify and categorize patients, not based on our DSM-5 diagnosis, but really getting down to looking at things like the degree of hope that an individual has, their concept of loneliness and other types of things. And what we're finding very early, that even though a person does a PHQ-9 for depression and there's a improvement on that PHQ-9, many people, more than 40% will say that they are not feeling resolved. We're starting to find other areas that are more linked to a person feeling more resolved or satisfied by what's happening in treatment. The whole issue of hope was one of the major ones, which was surprising but not surprising in that regard. It's also something that if a person doesn't have hope, they will have a tendency to drop out of treatment. So it's that kind of data that we're starting to go after, but what we realize from looking at the data, we're not there. We so need those markers in order to be more exact and very specific and effective.
Thank you. And Dave, following on Rhonda's comments, and let's say on this topic of AI, which we heard about a bit yesterday as well from President Obama, AI seems like it's really an increasingly powerful driver of innovation across all of society, certainly including in healthcare. And President Obama yesterday reiterated the sobering discrepancy between the really rapid pace of disruptive advancements in AI-based technology and the sluggish pace of our moral and ethical and regulatory frameworks for dealing with even the foreseeable challenges, let alone those conundrums that are a lot less apparent. So with healthcare poised to be dramatically reimagined by the AI revolution, and with issues, what issues concern you the most, for healthcare overall and psychiatry in particular, and how might you envision that we try and go about trying to mitigate that risk without unnecessarily stifling the innovation?
It's a great question, Steve. And first, thank you, and thanks to Dr. Marks and to our hosts for having me here. One thing I want to point out, and I think I would be remiss if I didn't, President Obama made reference to Greece and Athens being sort of the seat of democracy and democratic principles 2,500 years plus ago. Well, we could say the same thing for ethics, and I'm talking about Hippocrates and the Hippocratic Oath. And the Hippocratic Oath is still relevant today. My daughter graduated from medical school last month and took the Hippocratic Oath. It talks about our at least physicians' responsibility to do right by their patients, to do no harm, the importance of confidentiality. And that was a guardrail, I would view it that way, that was set up 2,500 years ago. And I think we can make a parallel here with precision medicine and precision psychiatry in particular to what President Obama was talking about with AI. I mean, the science we're hearing about is tremendous, and there is so much brain power going into developing it. But we also need guardrails to implement those advancements in a safe and responsible way. And I think that I really credit the center for being on top of that and thinking about that from the get-go. So what are the things that I think, name a few things. The first thing I want to mention that might be helpful, and it wouldn't be something I would have thought of, but I had the privilege of speaking with Divine and her father 2 days ago, and I asked Divine and her father, what would you like me to tell people? What do you think they need to know? And it was something that you wouldn't have got from Dr. Marks's presentation. What was most important to them was the way Dr. Marks treated her as a human being, his humanity, his interest in her, his realization that Divine has hopes and dreams the same way we all do, his interest in her family, his invitation to tell him anything that was on her mind. And I'm concerned that can get lost in the excitement of all of the science and of all of the data, that we still have to remember patient-centered care is important, and it's not just about giving people, 6 rounds of steroids or a new medication. And I think Rhonda made reference to that with hope, and I think it's connected to hope. Part of our job is to instill hope. So I think there are a number of things that, the literature talks about that might be helpful. And I'll just name a few. One is healthcare literacy. And I don't mean that, I mean that both for patients in order to make an informed choice about whether they want to provide their genetic data, whether they want to participate and accept a certain intervention, but just as importantly, healthcare literacy for providers. I mean, this is all new and amazing technology and science that I think most providers don't know about, and they need to learn about it. So that is certainly important. I think clearly, the protection of data and security of data, I think that goes without saying, and, Rhonda could probably say more than I can about that, but it's clear we need that. Obviously, access to care and really making sure that everyone, and Dr. Marks spoke about this, making sure everybody has access to the benefits of this new technology. And I think it's pretty clear most For example, most genetic studies involve people of European ancestry, white people. That needs to be expanded. Those samples need to be more diverse. That's not a simple task, right? What do we mean by diverse? Do we mean ancestrally diverse? Do we mean including historically disenfranchised groups who have suffered the burdens of that disease? So we need to think about that. And finally, I guess I would also say we need to include transparency. I mean, a lot of this, is sort of when you're using artificial intelligence, and people sitting on either side of me know much more about this than I do, but it almost seems like a black box, and something pops out the other end. And I think people will want to know, well, how did you reach those conclusions? And, what does it mean to have a 20% risk of something versus an 80% risk? And how am I to understand that? So those are a couple of thoughts.
So following on this sort of theme of, science inspired by our patients and going back again and drawing on the experience of Divine, Rui, I wanted to ask you that, modern neuroscience has become increasingly interested in not just being focused on the brain, but understanding the highly dynamic bidirectional modulation between the brain and the body. We saw that very clearly in Divine's case, which highlighted an immunological pathophysiology underlying her mental illness. In this regard, some of your own work has been increasingly focused in this area. Can you share with us some of the compelling examples of that and in the field, and how you see that impacting our emerging understanding of the biology of mental illness?
Absolutely. I mean, this patient example is a sobering awakening to all of us. But a lot of the big data is bringing this. Mental health disorders are disorders of the organism, and of the organism in its context. Ultimately, the impact we care about comes to the brain and nerve cells. And we have been focused, myself included, but a lot of neuroscience on how we perceive the external world. How do we hear voices, see things, and how do we act in the external world? But the nervous system is all throughout our body, and it mostly is there also to sense everything that's going in our body and to act adaptively. So our nerve cells and nervous system can sense the immune state of the organism, can sense the stress, the metabolic state, and can also learn to control it like we learn a skill. It's just we're less aware of that. So when we study, for example, how is it that I learn to move my arm or develop a habit, some of the same circuits that come from the brain, let's say from the motor cortex to innervate my muscles, now we find there are parallel circuits that go and innervate the spleen, innervate the adrenal gland from motor cortex. So this type of biology is opening a new way to think organismally and much more integrated. And I think we need to do that. And also to take into account the individual experience, because it's complex, right? This all then happens on top of the individual experience.
Yes, so George, could I turn back to you? I know Regeneron has a whole drug development program around immunology and immunomodulatory drugs. How do you see this sort of fitting in, from the perspective of mental illness, like the prior case that we just had? Do you think that there needs to be sort of a rethinking in terms of drug development, for neuropsychiatric disorders, rather than necessarily so focused on the brain, but sort of more broadly on, on the body overall?
Yeah, I feel like I have to, once again, inject just a little bit of reality to everybody's thinking. We're talking so much. We all feel the hope, the excitement. We saw this incredible example with Divine, which is literally unprecedented. But we all have to realize that we are so far away. We really are. We're so far away from really understanding neuropsychiatric disease. We're so far away from treating it. The idea that somebody might have today, if it turns out to be true and if it actually works out, we're 10 years from the reality. That means it'll take at least 10 years to develop and test an effective medicine that might help one of these patients. It shows how hard it is, and as a society, we cannot underestimate the amount of commitment and investment that we have to make in innovation and invest in the sciences that are necessary to deal with all these diseases. I think that we should all appreciate that society is drowning under the burden of healthcare, and we are very far away from treating and coming with effective treatments for most of these diseases, and neuropsychiatric diseases are the ones that we're the furthest from. We're all investing in it now, but as a society, we have to understand that if we really want treatments, it's not about providing access to treatments that are available. Most treatments are just not available. We don't have them. And as a society, we have to make much huger investments. We have to understand, see what the pandemic did to us in terms of crippling us. That's just one pandemic, one disease. The pandemic of all diseases is going to be crushing to humanity. To me, I liken it to climate change. We have to really up our investments to deal with these truly existential threats that are facing mankind. So sure, we have hope. We have excitement. As I said, we're intimidated. This is why we need so much partnership in this field. Neuropsychiatric diseases are a whole nother level. It's hard enough to treat obesity and diabetes, which we can sort of see, we can understand a lot more. To treat neuropsychiatric illnesses, we have to really up our investment. We have to up our game. Otherwise, like I said, society is going to drown from the impact of these diseases. And this is something that we have to all come together and understand. Regeneron, we're trying to do our part, as you said. We think that you have to bring in a whole new age of therapies. We're very committed to it, but it's a long game. So we are working right now to deliver, people think about gene medicines. The biggest problem with gene medicines is how to deliver them to the right cell in the body or the right cell in the brain. You don't want to impact every cell in the brain. As we talked about before, when we brought up BRAF, it only goes wrong in this cell in the skin. Okay, you don't want to correct it everywhere because you might cause problems if you correct it everywhere. So we're investing a lot in targeted delivery of genetic medicines. We're in the infancy of this field. It's very exciting. We just announced with our collaborators at Alnylam the first example of what you call gene silencing of a specific gene in the brain using what you call siRNA a few weeks ago. It's very exciting, but it's just the beginning. And we have to understand as a society, there's reason to have hope, there's reason to have excitement, but we need commitment and we need investment and we need to all up our game because this threat of disease, it's so pervasive, it's so prevalent, and it's so crushing to society that if we don't deal with it, it'll really take society under, just like climate change will.
Rhonda, I'm going to give you the final word because I'm watching the time here. So let me sort of pose the big picture question to you earlier. You said that my question was very loaded, which of course it was. So while precision psychiatry has the potential to greatly advance mental health care, its full-scale implementation is likely to be both highly disruptive and, a long path off, as George is saying. How do you envision the near-term emergence, as, sitting in such a profound, healthcare delivery and payer sort of perspective, how do you envision, if at all, the near-term emergence of precision psychiatry in the clinic?
Thank you for that question, Stephen. So the definition of near term needs to be clear. I think we all know from crossing the quality chasm to err as human that it takes 18 years to get a new, innovative, proven evidence base to be adopted and actually utilized in the delivery system. So add on to what George is talking about, another 18, maybe 20, 25 years, because this is very, very new and innovative type of thinking that most people who have been trained will not understand in some way, shape, or form. I would say that there are some elements that are very important to the ability to implement. One is clearly being able to have those markers. I'm not saying bio, because it may be a different kind of a marker, but that the marker can be linked to treatment. And so that there can be clarity from the idea of measuring the effect of treatment. As I said to you, Using PHQ-9 GAD7 isn't getting it, you guys. You need more in terms of neurocognitive ways of measuring so that you're getting the fine-tuning of the elements that have to do with progress as it relates to treatment. So that has to be there. There has to be consistency and standardization so that you can look across populations and look at trends. We have large numbers, but we don't always have standardization, so you really can't compare. That information needs to be incorporated into what I call a learning system, a system where providers as well as patients get this information back. They could look at themselves and compare it to others. They can look at the progress. The National Institute of Mental Health and Health are starting to really go that way with their projects like All About Us, where you as a person can register and start putting your data in. So it's a big data type of a chase. Those things are going to be very important. So as the science and the markers become identified, we can work with that against the various treatments, because right now we're in a trial and error type of a process. That will help us to get closer to be, okay, out of time, very concise or more concise and efficient in the way that we deliver a treatment for whatever that marker is.
Well, I want to thank all of my panelists and just end with at least, one of my serious takeaways from this, which is, A, there's a lot of hope, but B, we have to be very humble to the enormous challenge that's ahead, and that the only way to solve this is going to be continued investment and partnership and finding ways to bridge across all of these different domains, because this is really a collective effort of the field that no individual person or group is going to be able to accomplish. Thank you very much.